Can I tell you something about how at the end of Prohibition, the nation's finest bootleggers all got together and created the car racing series that we know today as NASCAR?
Please do.
Okay, I'm going to do a little cause and effect, a little painting the scene of how we go from bootleggers to NASCAR.
Thank you, because I think there's definitely some blanks I need filled in.
And I'm sure that this is a story that a lot of people that know of NASCAR or have watched NASCAR are very familiar with. But for those of us that are kind of on the outside looking into the NASCAR world, that whole genre of entertainment, you know, I'm not really in the know, but now I am in the know of this historical connection. So
let's get into it.
This all begins in the late 18th century. The Revolutionary War just ended. America is in debt. Alexander Hamilton is rapping in the streets of New York.
Alexander Hamilton.
And one of the big crises that early America has to go through is imposing a tax. And what did they tax? They couldn't tax the tea. They taxed the liquor.
Not the booze, man. Not the booze.
And so because of this tax on liquor, people started making their own liquor illegally under the light of the moon or at night. This would be known as moonshine.
I feel like a lot of our nation's greatest things or discoveries have happened at night under the moon.
I think that crime tends to lead to a lot of the greatest creations that America has. It just like the underbelly of society really gives America its greatest contributions. And so because of that, like history is really interesting because you pick up those facts when it's okay to start talking about them again. And so that's kind of how NASCAR's history with bootleggers really is. At the time it was stigmatized, but
okay, so I really want to ground myself in the life of a bootlegger.
Mm-hmm. So,
I want to become the bootlegger. So we're in the late 18th century. It's cold out. It's nighttime.
And you're probably in Appalachia, up in the mountains where people are making moonshine.
That's too bad. But, you know, things are looking up because I got a little recipe down my sleeve.
Or down your boot. So bootleggers are the people that transport moonshine. And that all comes from this image of people hiding booze in their boot and like going to trade booze that's like hidden on their person. So booze in the bootleggers, that's where we get that term. And that's where we get it today when we're like, oh, I got a bootleg copy of this movie, this TV show. It's because people are hiding liquor in their boots way back when.
I love that.
I'm going to start fast forwarding here. So we are going past the 18th century. We're going past the 19th century. We're now in the early 20th century. And at this time, there's been a storm brewing around the sins of alcohol.
Oh.
And how alcohol is really causing all of the harm in society. And so in 1919, the 18th Amendment is passed, banning the sale of alcohol throughout all of the United States. And it would be this way until 1933. Now, at this time, Americans were drinking. Like, that's
sure
plenty obvious. And like, you think about the Roaring 20s, the Great Gatsby, that sort of stuff. If they're drinking there is one way that they're getting their booze. It's either they had old booze from before Prohibition, or they got it from moonshiners and it was delivered by bootleggers. And so bootleggers at that time with cars would pack their cars as full as possible with moonshine, and they would have to outwit the law in order to make their deliveries of all of this contraband. And so you can start to see that adept driving skills were really important for bootleggers during Prohibition. There was like a culture built around these people that could take normal street cars, make them run really fast, fill them with moonshine, and outrun the cops. And so those people started making informal races during Prohibition so they could compete for bragging rights about who was the better bootlegger.
Oh, top dog, top
So
bootlegger of the week.
So like street racing today, like very much it like
I was
not
gonna
the
say
same, but similar.
But it seems very reminiscent of that time. And if we know anything about humans, we know that we love a little game.
We love a little game.
It makes the day go by faster, especially if you're at work, you're a bootlegger. Oh, you gotta drive again? Are you kidding me? Let's make this happen, man. Let's make this juicy.
And so this general set of constraints of people, they needed to go from like in the middle of nowhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in the woodses, where all of this moonshine was being made, and they had to drive it into cities. They got really, really good at driving on dirt roads. They got really good at driving at night. They knew everything like the back of their hand.
You think they could even parallel park?
No way. And so this is where I want to introduce some of the bootlegging tactics and techniques that I found in my research, because some of these just sound like utterly insane in terms of the types of people that would do these tactics to evade the law. So one of the things that they would do in a lot of their cars is they would remove the floorboards for extra space for booze. Not super crazy. They would also remove the passenger and the back seats of the cars for more booze to be stored. They would also install extra stiff suspension to deal with all of the weight of all of that booze in their car. They would have better tires than like anyone else on the street, because if you blew a tire while outrunning the cops, like you would flip your car and end up on the side of the road. And that will bring me to some of my first historical artifacts, because there's not a lot that remains from the Prohibition era with these bootleggers, because it's not like they're flaunting their cars on social media like we would today. So anything that we do know is really because of bootleggers that got caught. This is courtesy of the Library of Congress, but you can see here a car that is like absolutely totaled. So like some of the earliest bootleg cars were the Ford Model T, which when you think of like old-timey car, it's the Ford Model T.
Okay, so one of my childhood best friends growing up, her dad, I don't know if it was a Model T. I'm sorry, I'm not a car girl, but had a car very, very similar to this. So I have seen one in person. And now that I'm looking at the bootlegged version of it, I can proudly say that I would never get behind that wheel. For those of you who can't see it, it's basically kind of like the longest car you've ever seen, with every part possible fallen off of it and or bent in some way. But it looks, because it's a Model T, it looks so much worse than like our cars. Like, yes, it is a totaled car, but take it 10 notches further.
Because I mean, there's no safety behind
like there's no floorboards. Okay, so that's my question. Now really seeing those photos, you mentioned all of the little adjustments the bootleggers would make. If I were a cop, not saying I am, but if I were.
If you were.
And I was driving past one of these guys,
Yeah.
and I saw no floorboards,
Yeah.
no passenger seat,
Mm-hmm.
I'm pulling them over immediately. So why on earth would... Okay, I'll rephrase that. I understand why they took it out, because they needed to store more alcohol. But wouldn't it be smarter to make like decoy seats? Like filled with alcohol? Like it's a little suspicious that they're altering cars that much. I know there's like not really regulation of cars at this time, but it's still sus.
I mean, it's hard to say what it was like at the time. Bootleggers weren't hanging around and parking their car much. And when they would park their car, it wouldn't be full of moonshine. And so it's like, if you can't be caught with the moonshine on you, then you can just be caught with
a dilapidated car. And that's not a crime.
It's not a crime to have a weird car at that time.
I get that, but I guess I'm sensing, there's not just one bootlegger. This is a big crew.
Yes.
So eventually cops are going to catch on to a pattern.
Yeah. So that's where I don't know enough about Prohibition to say why you couldn't just spot the pattern with these cars too. Because from what I know about Prohibition, I mean, it's the rise of organized crime too. So I would imagine that a lot of police were a bit more careful around busting bootleggers. There's probably a bit more nuance
for sure.
to
And
catching that
I
behavior.
think also cops paying attention to cars
Mhm.
is a newer phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure way back when, a little over 100 years ago,
Yeah.
cops were worried about crime that they could actually see.
Yes.
And like, we know that there were basically no laws with cars at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm kind of answering my own question. I understand why that didn't happen, but
Yeah.
looking at it from like my modern view I have now, it kind of looks like, oh man, like they really got away with this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I
No,
mean? Like
I
it's
get
a little
exactly what you mean.
like I'm kind of happy for it because Prohibition's really juicy, and I think there's some good stories that come out of it. But
yeah.
looking back, it's such a funky crime.
Yeah. Bootlegging is weird.
When I think about all the crimes committed today, I'm like, really?
I mean, I would just compare it to like trafficking drugs today, like because that's essentially the status that all alcohol was put under. But it would be the difference is like that it was so culturally ingrained and legal for so long, and then suddenly banned. And the desire doesn't just go away when that happens. And we've learned a lot.
In fact, it gets larger.
Yeah, everyone wants what they can't have. I'm going to introduce you to what I consider like the absolute insane techniques that they deployed to be able to get away with bootlegging this moonshine. Bootleggers would often turn off their headlights when being chased by cars or by police at night, because they knew these dirt roads so well that they would be flying through mountain roads with their lights off in an all-black car as to not be seen. They also would have steel plates put in front of the radiator of their car in case police tried to shoot holes in their radiator and cause the engine to overheat, which would put them on the side of the road. The other thing that they did is some cars were rigged to produce clouds of smoke, drop oil at a moment's notice, like it was like Mario Kart dropping bananas, or drop nails. And so,
oh my gosh.
So when I learned these facts, I was like, why isn't there a prohibitionist bootlegger car racing game? Like, this is crazy.
There is.
Yes, there eventually was, and it's called NASCAR. But like, this is where we have this culture of taking cars that you could buy from a dealership, modifying them to the limit, and then needing to drive them as fast as possible. And then those drivers competing for bragging rights between one another. And then Prohibition ends, and then most of them are out of work.
They got to do something.
You can't put that on your LinkedIn at that time. And so there was this culture that was already developed around racing these stock cars, which would eventually turn into NASCAR, which stands for National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing. NASCAR started sometime between December 12th, 1947 and February 21st, 1948. The reason for that range is there is no consensus on like what is the genesis event of NASCAR. More or less it was planned out. Some people cite the first race, some people cite the first like planned to race. But between the end of 1947 and start of 1948, NASCAR was created. Are you familiar with the Daytona 500, or have you heard of it?
I have heard of it. I wouldn't call myself familiar.
I wouldn't call myself really familiar with it either, but it was like one of the first NASCAR tracks. And I don't know if it held the very first NASCAR race, because that history, as you can tell here, is a bit iffy, but the later end of those dates centers around the first race at Daytona, and it ended in a photo finish. And so what I learned from this history of NASCAR documentary is like they had to develop these photo negatives to see who actually won the race, and it went on for days. Like competing photographers were trying to figure out who actually won. And it really shows like at the beginning what the technology around NASCAR was like and how far it's gone into an engineered sport and like a very scientific sport. A lot of the older drivers were talking about how these bootleggers had to both be drivers and mechanics because they're responsible for their own vehicle. If they got thrown off the side of the road, they got to figure out how to fix the flat. They can't resort to a pit crew. But now you have these huge teams, these engineers and everything, where a lot of the performance of a racer is dependent on the equipment they have around them rather than the racer themselves. So it makes this initial period of NASCAR really interesting because you have all of these really talented drivers that were bootleggers. And one of the most famous bootleggers to ever grace the NASCAR circuit was this guy named Junior Johnson. And he discovered techniques like drafting cars. Do you know what drafting is by chance?
Is drafting like in Mario Kart where you hold one side and you go across the side?
That's drifting.
Oh, that's drifting.
But actually kind of close. I got a Mario Kart analogy. You know when you are behind someone's cart in Mario Kart
Yep.
for a bit and then all of a sudden you go really fast?
Yes.
That's what drafting is.
So it's kind of tailing behind someone and doing a little sneak attack around the side.
A little bit, because the person in front of you has to deal with all of the wind and like cutting through all that air. So there's like a little vacuum behind them. So the car doesn't have to pump as hard to achieve the same speed. And so this guy would just like tail behind people and then just pass them. Like all these like classic racing techniques.
Technique, more or less.
Yeah. And there's this really good quote that he said too when talking about the difference between being like a bootlegger and dealing with moonshine versus NASCAR. He said, "Moonshiners put more time, energy, thought, and love into their cars than any racer ever will. Lose on the track and you go home. Lose with a load of whiskey and you go to jail." So that really describes the difference in NASCAR today versus this inception of it. It's difficult to imagine how NASCAR went from this bootlegging hobby, this little sport where people in the underbelly of society were racing one another, to becoming a really brand-friendly auto racing circuit. And a big reason why there was that change was because in 1971, tobacco was banned from advertising on television and on radio. And at the time, NASCAR was a prime up-and-coming market for them to dump their ad budget into. So the tobacco industry just threw tons and tons of money into NASCAR, sponsoring all sorts of events because they couldn't advertise on radio and television anymore. And so the 70s are known as this period where there is this huge swing towards the mechanical, the engineered side of NASCAR rather than the bootleg side of NASCAR. And that eventually kind of turns into what we know as NASCAR today, this big corporate venture.
Thank you so much for that story. I feel like I actually learned a lot and also kind of got an appreciation for a sport that I must admit I did not consider a sport before this.
Yeah.
And it really does make me think about other events in history that are so normalized now that I have no idea what the backstory is behind it. And that makes me really excited.
Yeah.
To look into some more stories like this. And I know, like you said in the beginning, this is a pretty well-known story.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't to me, but to others it is. But I do like how NASCAR has kind of gone through different phases.
Different eras,
Different
if you will.
eras, yeah. And now, you know, again, this is not something that I watch, but there are plenty of people in my family who do. And so I've like kind of been around it. I know a few things here and there. I watched Cars.
Me too. Me too.
But it does give me a deeper appreciation for where sports come from. And I really like learning the stories behind it.
Yeah, the story is, I think, really interesting. What I was noting a lot, the difference between how old NASCAR was described versus new NASCAR, especially in like some of these documentaries that I was watching that were, I think, made in the early 2000s. And there seemed to be this big push of, tell me if you've heard this before, it's the fastest growing sport.
Always.
Yeah, so NASCAR has had a lot of those, it's the fastest growing sport in the US moments. And they want to appear really brand friendly. They want to be considered one of the major American sports, which for those of you who are like, oh, what are the major American sports? Football, basketball, hockey, and baseball are considered like the 4 major American sports. And so NASCAR wants to be a part of that. A lot of sports want to be a part of that ethos, but not many of them actually bridge that gap. And so it's interesting to see how NASCAR managed to bridge that gap. And a lot of it has to do with the tobacco industry.
I want to actually learn more about this tobacco phase of NASCAR.
Yes.
Because we know that NASCAR's been around for almost 100 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So naturally, it's going to go through phases of popularity. And like you said, it's kind of been fighting to be a major sport. I think kind of like golf and chess, maybe.
Yeah.
Right? Like everyone kind of knows about it, but not everyone actually spends their time watching it.
Yeah.
How does tobacco, I don't know, maybe like reinvigorate NASCAR's popularity?
So that switch from it being a bootlegger sport to being a really expensive sport is just really because Big Tobacco had their ad budget redirected right into NASCAR. And NASCAR at that time had a really, I would say like family friendly image.
How did it get that from bootlegging?
Yeah, so like a lot of that I think was because there was a stigma around bootleggers at that time, and so people weren't really so loud and proud about it. Like most of the stuff that I was learning about bootlegging in this research was from bootleggers like decades after they were
admitting that they were a bootlegger, more or less.
Yeah, and like talking about details with all of that. If NASCAR was going to make it as a sport, it needed to not be the bootlegger sport. It had to be more than street racing.
It sounds like it almost had to be legitimized by a company or by an influx of cash, which is what tobacco brought it. Yeah. And now that you say that, and I know we kind of talked about it, but it really reminds me of cars and thinking about, like Lightning McQueen being the face of Rusty's or whatever that was, right?
It's
and like
exactly right.
Having the ads physically printed on the cars. And I know like I'm thinking of a NASCAR driver today and not the costume they wear, but like the
driving
the gear they wear. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And there's logos everywhere.
Yeah.
It makes sense. But I'm also thinking about other American sports. And you look at arenas now and there are ads everywhere. And it feels like if you're physically attending a sport, yes, there are ads in the arena.
Yeah.
But if you're watching the sport on television, there's digital ads imprinted onto the arena. And so that could be a whole other topic. But it sounds like NASCAR was kind of, I don't know if it was like setting the stage for sports being incredibly profitable, because it sounds like this would be probably not the first, but one of the first very, very popular sports to be the face of a brand that the country itself is not supporting, but the people who live in the country are consuming.
There's no local Seattle NASCAR team. There's no Denver NASCAR team.
They're just people.
They're just people. So the way that team lines are divided is usually by drivers. And in the early days, it was actually by the vehicle manufacturers. Like people would be kind of Team Ford, Team Chevy. But
isn't that still the case though?
Yeah, for sure. It's a part of,
Because then that goes into, sorry to sabotage what you're saying, but
course.
You said in the beginning that altering the cars from the factory in a very specific way was kind of half of the sport, right?
Yeah.
Like the science behind it, which actually gives me a huge appreciation for it. But that, again, I'm getting sidetracked here.
Yeah.
That's the team in itself. That's the state. And that's really cool because it's not regional. Oh gosh, I don't want to be a simp for a company though. No,
that's the weird bit. So
but it's also cool, right? For it to be a different, I don't know, like a different take on sports. Is that a weird thing to say? Like,
well, it's a different way of splitting up teams, and so that happens in very few sports. I think racing sports tend to be the ones that do that the most
because it comes down to gear, more or less, or like your machinery behind you, whereas other sports come down to physical skill.
Yeah. The another comparison is like the Tour de France, like the big old bike race. The teams are not national at all. They're like grouped together by brands.
But the difference with that, and I know that this is, now we're talking about like a non-American televised event.
Yeah.
But those sports, like I wouldn't say that biking is something that Americans are tuning into.
No.
But
not the same
NASCAR
rate.
is. And so when we talk about sports that have kind of surpassed that big four that you said,
Mhm.
American football, basketball, baseball, hockey, this offers something different that those sports can't. Because the big call for sports is, what team are you rooting for? Where are you from?
Yeah.
Where did you move? Kind of thing. That's who you root for, no one else. But for this, it's like, are you a Mercedes-Benz or are you a BMW? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it adds a flex. I remember having to justify liking Seattle teams to like my Boston relatives, because it's like I wasn't born in Seattle, but I feel more geographically connected to Seattle teams than I do to Boston teams because of where I am right now.
Right.
And that geographic part of sports is huge, and NASCAR supersedes that. It's like, are you team tied? Like, who's your favorite driver? Like, those are the questions that get asked when it comes to loyalty.
And I do just want to make a connection here, because I'm not a sports girly. I wasn't raised in a sports-centric household either. So it's like, yes, there are people in my family who enjoy that, but that's not me.
Yeah.
I'm an arts girl, okay? I am tuning in to whatever it might be. And the arts are centered around people. They're not centered around location. They can be, but they're not. They're like, who's your favorite actor? Who's your favorite actress? What's your favorite play? Oh, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite song? All of that comes down to individuals. And so when I hear about NASCAR and the history of it, it makes me, as a person who's actually very intimidated by sports culture, more or less American sports culture.
Yeah.
It makes me feel like I can actually approach NASCAR and not feel super unwelcome. Does that make sense? Like, and I'm not speaking for the overall culture, because I really don't know that much about it. But I will say, just knowing the history about this makes me feel like, hey, if there's a NASCAR at a little race, I might watch a highlight, you know?
Yeah.
Like, the culture seems a little more interesting. And I don't know if that's the word, but
it's different than the way we usually think about sports.
It's different. And I think the regionality and the fan base and the overall media coverage of traditional American sports really scares me. And it makes me, as a woman who's very creative and God knows what else, very shy to be a part of that.
Yeah.
But to be a part of this doesn't seem so bad. Does it interest me? No. Like I said, I'm not a car girl. I probably never will be. I don't know that much.
Yeah.
But I think I'd be curious to learn more. And that's something I don't feel with other sports.
Yeah. I think that what you've touched on there is the ultimate ask of any growing sport anywhere. There's that period of time that a sport goes from being played by a select few to becoming a big cultural phenomena. And it wasn't really that long ago that, I mean, the NBA was being played by people that, like, there's this joke that it's like, oh, you know, it was just a bunch of plumbers playing back then. It's like, well, yeah, because there wasn't enough money to be able to play basketball full time. So people had a job and they played basketball. That period of time, any sport's going to try and figure out a way to embrace as many people as possible. And
can I just really quick add on to that? This is a total tangent. You can cut this if you want.
Okay.
I'm a big Beyonce fan. Okay,
Yes.
just got to get that out there. And I was lurking on Reddit the other day and I saw a video. I'm sorry, I don't know who they were, but a father and a son music critic who had always passed off Beyonce as some ridiculous hotshot artist that is garbage because of single ladies.
Yeah.
And then they heard Lemonade and they were blown away by the complexity and just the overall emotional beauty that she could convey through her music. That's not something they'd ever seen on mainstream media.
Yeah.
Now, how does Beyonce relate to NASCAR? Well, she doesn't. But I feel like I'm kind of having a similar reaction here because, like I said, sports have always just kind of scared me, not only because I'm a woman, but because the overall culture is just too bro-y. Like, it's just, it seems impenetrable as a female. It just does. And I think peeling back the layers of a sport and looking into the history is actually really important because you said sports are kind of supposed to appeal to the masses.
Yeah.
But they never appealed to me. And so I've always kind of been like, well, why don't they? You know, why do I have such a problem with it?
Yeah.
And this is really making me challenge that. I'm not saying I'm going to start watching NASCAR tomorrow, like my life depends on it, but I think it will make me a more curious person.
Yeah.
And maybe make me a little braver in spaces that I previously wouldn't be before. Because I could never see myself talking about NASCAR.
But right? Here you are.
But here I am. And
yeah.
I think that if there's anything to take away from this episode, especially if you're someone like me out there, that sports are just terrifying and also just kind of boring and uninteresting, I urge you to look into the backstory of some of these. And maybe we'll do some in the future. I don't know. Maybe hockey has a cool backstory. Maybe there's some shenanigans going on there. I don't know.
I'm sure that there is. Yeah.
But I think that's a really good takeaway. That's at least a takeaway I have from this. Because there's only so much we can talk about NASCARs. We could go on and on for bootleggers. That I'm here for. But that's what I would take from it.
I think that you've found a lot of parts of sports that I personally enjoy, which I will say that I am like I have this weird relationship. I love sports, like, and I want to be clear, I love sports, right? But I truly despise American sports culture. I think it's really toxic. It wreaks havoc on the people that want to participate in that facet of entertainment, because to me, sports are really nothing but a cultural phenomena built around entertainment. Like, they are meant to entertain. They are meant to bring in crowds and have people enjoy themselves for a period of time. But I think what happens is people will take the competitive nature of sports and use that as an excuse to express egregious behavior. I think that is like the worst side of sports. There are multiple ways of approaching the same dynamic of competitive play. And I think that the US does need to kind of get their act together, stop bullying literal teenagers online that are in their first year of a job being watched by millions. I think that the best thing to do is realize that it is a game. There is beauty in the game. If your team is getting absolutely destroyed, there is usually something interesting going on as to why your team is losing by so much. That's where games are really fun, curious, interesting. That's where there can be a lot of discussion without it having to be personal. Like the result at the end of the day is what it is. But people fixate so hard on like the box scores, the final scores, the numbers, that they lose sight of truly remarkable athletic achievements that every single person competing in a televised sport's doing all the time. Just look at the way that they move. Look at the amount of dedication and focus that all of those athletes put into what they're doing. If someone's made to look silly, that person's usually incredibly good at what they do, and someone's just that much better than them at it. Like, marvel in that. That's what I think sports should be. It should be the performance and appreciating the performance, not whatever is going on ESPN First Take or anything like that.
Well, but I mean, yes, I agree with you, but I want to push back a little bit because let's bring it back to tobacco and NASCAR. There is a lot of money in sports. And like you said, yes, it is a sport, but it's also part of the entertainment industry. And with that come so many deficits. And so there are going to be a lot of ads and a lot of money poured into people feeling negative because that's what drives attention. That's why people watch. And so this is how I just bring it back to, like, just enjoy the story behind a sport you love. It doesn't have to be NASCAR. If that's not your thing, that's not your thing. If you love baseball, find a juicy story about it. Because you know what? I know for a fact from my father that there are plenty.
There are plenty of juicy stories.
If you like croquet, find a little croquet story, right? I think that's kind of going back to why we make our podcast is everyday stories, no matter how short or large they are, can make life more interesting. And they can explain why you're so passionate about something.
Yeah, I really like that.
So yeah, like, yes, there are negatives of sports. There are lots of positive of sports. That's not what this episode's about, I don't think. I love when you do your little tangents. I learn a lot from it.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back a little bit to what we learned today. With the bootleggers in Appalachia, doing their thing, evading the cops.
Dropping nails, puffs of smoke.
Mario Karting before that was a thing.
Yeah.
That's a really fun story.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really grateful that you shared it with me.
Well, I'm grateful that I had the chance to share it with you.
All right. Well, with that, I think that concludes our episode of the Can I Tell You Something podcast. But wait, there's more. We have changed our social media. We are now Rough Draft Media on TikTok and Rough Draft Seattle on Instagram. Because Can I Tell You Something wasn't really floating our boat. So Rough Draft Media is the name of our media company we run out of here in Seattle. We also have a new and improved website, hopefully launching soon, but maybe by the time you've seen this, it has, roughdraftmedia.com. You can contact us there if you have any questions or any stories you want us to share. All right, well, we will see you next week with another edition of the Can I Tell You Something podcast.
Right, bye.
Bye.